A 13-year-old girl walked into a cockpit during an emergency. The pilot screamed at her to leave. She didn't. 2 minutes later, that same pilot was doing exactly what she told him to do, and 192 people were still alive because of it. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was a Sunday. 4:17 p.m. December 15, 2019. The instrument panel was lying. That is what Captain Brandon Walsh kept telling himself. He stared at the altimeter showing 8,000 feet while the ground proximity warning system screamed that terrain was only 400 feet below. He stared at the airspeed indicator showing 240 knots while the aircraft shuddered like it was about to stall. He stared at the attitude indicator showing wings perfectly level while every single nerve in his body told him they were in a steep 35-degree bank. And when First Officer Amanda Rivera reached for the controls to override the instruments, when her hand froze in mid-air because she did not know which gauge to believe, when Brandon screamed into the radio that they were flying completely blind with 192 passengers aboard and maybe 4 minutes before they either hit a mountain or ran out of altitude entirely, a small voice came from behind them. 8 words. 8 quiet, calm, absolutely certain words that made both pilots spin around in pure shock. Your instruments aren't broken. Your brain is. Standing in the cockpit doorway was a 13-year-old girl. Skinny. Maybe 5 feet tall. Wearing a purple hoodie that said, "Math is my superpower," in gold glitter letters. Light-up sneakers that flashed purple and pink with every nervous step she took. Round glasses sliding down her nose. Long dark hair in a single braid. A yellow unaccompanied minor lanyard hanging around her neck. She looked exactly like what she appeared to be. A middle school kid. A child. Someone who should have been sitting in her seat watching a movie or sleeping. Brandon Walsh stared at her. 22 years of flying. 18,000 hours in the air. 3 decades of experience that had taught him instruments do not all fail at the same time. He stared at this child standing in his cockpit doorway while his aircraft was in a steep banking descent toward the Rocky Mountains, and he screamed 4 words that would later be played in congressional hearings investigating this exact incident. Get out. It's impossible. Because what she was suggesting was impossible. The idea that every single gauge was working perfectly. The idea that his own brain was creating contradictions through spatial disorientation so severe he could not tell up from down. The idea that he was experiencing the deadliest psychological illusion in all of aviation history. The idea that he needed to trust instruments that felt completely and entirely wrong to every sensation in his experienced body. Impossible for a veteran pilot to accept. Impossible for 22 years of experience to comprehend. And apparently, only fixable by a 13-year-old girl who had never flown a real aircraft in her life but understood the mathematics of 3-dimensional spatial orientation better than any pilot currently flying in American aviation. Her name was Isabella Vasquez. And she was about to do something that would be called the most sophisticated piece of spatial problem-solving ever documented in aviation emergency response history. Let us go back to the beginning of that Sunday. Southwest Flight 3742. Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport to Denver International Airport. Boeing 737-800. 192 passengers. 6 crew members. Sunday afternoon departure at 2:34 p.m. Mountain Time. It was a routine flight. The kind that happens hundreds of times every single day across America. Weekend travel. Families returning home after Thanksgiving weekend visits. Business travelers wrapping up trips. College students heading back to Colorado schools after spending the holiday with Arizona relatives. The cabin had that familiar Sunday afternoon feeling to it. People tired from weekends away, settling into their seats, ready to land, ready to go home, ready to start preparing mentally for Monday. Row 9. Economy class. Left side of the aircraft. Seats A, B, and C, window, middle, and aisle. In seat 9A, the window seat, sat a woman named Jennifer. 41 years old. Real estate agent. She was working on her laptop, answering client emails before the Wi-Fi connected, a coffee cup wedged between her knees, completely absorbed in her professional world. In seat 9B, the middle seat, sat a man named Robert. 67 years old. Retired high school teacher. He was deep into a Tom Clancy novel, the thick kind with a bent spine from being read so many times, completely lost inside the story and paying zero attention to anyone around him. And in seat 9C, the aisle seat, sat a girl. A child. She looked exactly like what she was on the surface. A middle school student traveling alone. Around 5 feet tall. Skinny in that preteen way where limbs seem slightly too long for the body. Mixed race, Latina and white, with light brown skin, long dark hair braided neatly down her back, and round wire-frame glasses that kept sliding down her nose every few minutes, requiring a small push back up with one finger. She was wearing black leggings, a large purple hoodie with the words, "Math is my superpower," written across the chest in gold glitter lettering, and a pair of light-up sneakers that flashed purple and pink whenever her feet moved. Around her neck was the yellow lanyard with the plastic sleeve containing her unaccompanied minor paperwork. On her back was a bright purple backpack covered in small pins, the NASA logo, the SpaceX rocket, a "Girls Who Code" badge, the symbol for pi, and Albert Einstein sticking his tongue out. She was not watching a movie. She was not listening to music. She was not scrolling through her phone or sleeping or staring out the window. She was working in a notebook. An ordinary marble composition notebook. The cheap kind you buy at Target for $1.50. But inside it was not ordinary at all. The pages were filled with mathematical equations written in sharp, precise pencil. Diagrams. Three-dimensional coordinate systems. Rotation matrices. Pages of calculus. Advanced mathematics at a level that belongs in university graduate courses, not in the hands of a 13-year-old on a Sunday afternoon flight. She was solving problems. Voluntarily. For fun. Jennifer had glanced at the notebook during boarding and assumed it was advanced homework. Something her school had assigned over Thanksgiving break. She had not looked twice. Robert had not looked at the girl at all. The flight attendants had checked on her twice, as protocol requires for unaccompanied minors, using that particular sing-song voice adults use when they speak to children they do not expect much from. "Are you okay, sweetie?" She had nodded. Smiled politely. Gone directly back to her math. Just another kid. Another responsibility to monitor. Nobody important. Her ticket said, I. Vasquez. Age 13. Guardian pickup, Dr. M. Vasquez, DAA. All of that was accurate. Her name was Isabella Vasquez. Age 13. 8th grade. Her mother was Dr. Maria Vasquez, an aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin in Denver. Isabella was flying back from Phoenix, where she had spent Thanksgiving week with her grandmother, returning home to Denver where she lived with her mom during the school year. Every single one of those facts was true. But those facts were like describing Albert Einstein as a patent office clerk. Technically accurate. Missing the entire point. Isabella Vasquez was not just a 13-year-old who was good at math for her age. She was a mathematical prodigy of a kind that comes along perhaps once in a generation. Not the kind that wins school competitions or skips a grade or two. The kind whose mind operates at a level that most PhD candidates spend entire careers trying to reach and never quite get there. Her IQ had been measured at 192. That number sits so far above the standard scale that most IQ tests simply cannot measure it accurately. Standard tests max out and return numbers that are technically approximations of something much larger. She had started reading at age 2. Not children's books with colorful pictures and simple sentences. Her mother's aerospace engineering textbooks. She would sit on the floor of her mother's home office and turn pages carefully, and her mother initially thought she was just looking at the diagrams. Then one evening, when Isabella was 2 years and 4 months old, she pointed at a diagram of a force vector calculation and said the word "wrong" clearly and pointed at where the error was. Her mother had checked. Isabella had been correct. By age 5, Isabella was solving algebra problems. By age 7, she was working through calculus. By age 9, her mother was arranging for her to audit university-level courses in advanced mathematics at the University of Colorado, where professors initially assumed there had been some administrative mistake when a 9-year-old walked into their graduate seminars and then stopped assuming that after the first class session. By age 11, Isabella had published a paper on three-dimensional rotation matrices in aerospace applications. A paper that Lockheed Martin, her mother's employer, was actively using in flight control systems design. An 11-year-old's research being used in real aircraft engineering. And now, at age 13, she was working on her second paper. The topic was spatial disorientation in pilots. The mathematical models that explain why human perception fails in three-dimensional space. Why the human vestibular system, the inner ear system that tells us which way is up, can be fooled catastrophically when a human being is moving through 3 dimensions without a visual horizon. Why experienced pilots crash perfectly functional aircraft because their brain tells them they are right side up when they are actually inverted or in a steep banking spiral. Why instruments say one thing while the human body screams something completely opposite and entirely wrong. How your own perception can kill you faster than any mechanical failure ever could. Isabella had spent 6 months building mathematical models of spatial disorientation. She had read every piece of research published on the subject. She had studied accident reports. She had interviewed, through her mother's professional connections, actual pilots who had experienced it and survived. She had built equations that modeled the exact geometry of how the human vestibular system loses track of orientation during gradual banking maneuvers, how the brain adapts to a slowly increasing bank angle and recalibrates it as the new normal, and how that recalibration creates a devastating illusion when the pilot finally looks at instruments showing the actual reality. She had never flown an aircraft. She had never sat in a cockpit. She had never held flight controls in her hands. But she understood the mathematics of what happens to a pilot's brain during spatial disorientation better than most flight instructors who teach about it every single day. She understood the geometry of it. The physics of it. The reason it happens and the mathematical proof of why instruments are always more reliable than human perception in three-dimensional flight. She was working on page 47 of her notebook when the aircraft banked. 4:17 p.m. Mountain Time. 23,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. Isabella was deep in a rotation matrix calculation that modeled a pilot's perception during a descending spiral. She was working through the equation carefully, her pencil moving in small precise motions, when she felt it. The aircraft banked. Not aggressively. Not in any way that would alarm a casual passenger. A gentle, gradual lean to the right. She estimated approximately 15 degrees without even thinking about it. The estimation came automatically, the way a musician hears a note slightly out of tune without consciously analyzing the frequency. Normal. Probably a standard course correction. She went back to her equations. 37 seconds later, the bank increased. Now approximately 25 degrees. Isabella looked up from her notebook. She had not consciously decided to look up. Her brain had noticed something and flagged it before she was fully aware of the flag. A 25-degree bank for a commercial aircraft in cruise flight was not normal. Too steep for a standard turn. Not emergency steep, not yet, but outside the normal parameters of commercial aviation. She looked across the aisle toward the windows on the right side of the aircraft. She could see the horizon through the small oval windows. It was tilted. Significantly. And below, the Rocky Mountains were visible, and they were closer than they should have been at cruise altitude. They were descending. Fast. The PA system crackled. Captain Walsh's voice came through, and Isabella heard something in his voice immediately, a quality that she had read about in pilot testimonies but had never heard with her own ears: controlled panic. The specific vocal pattern of someone who is deeply trained to remain professional while experiencing something they do not understand and genuinely fear. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some instrument anomalies. We are working through it. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Instrument anomalies. Isabella's brain shifted into a different gear. The gear she shifted into when a problem she had been studying theoretically suddenly became real. Multiple simultaneous instrument failures were statistically nearly impossible. The redundant systems on a Boeing 737-800 were specifically designed to prevent any single failure from cascading into multiple failures. For every instrument to be showing different information simultaneously, for the altimeter and the attitude indicator and the airspeed indicator all to be malfunctioning at the same moment, the probability was so low it was essentially zero. Unless the instruments were not failing at all. Unless the instruments were all correct and telling the same story. Unless the person reading them was the one whose information had become unreliable. Oh. The word formed in Isabella's mind with the particular quality of mathematical recognition. The way a long equation suddenly resolves when you finally see the right substitution. The way a proof clicks together when you finally see the pathway through. Spatial disorientation. Her research topic. Happening in real time. Right now. On her flight. The aircraft banked steeper. Isabella estimated 35 degrees now. She could feel it in her body, in the way gravity pulled her slightly sideways in her seat, in the way the wing outside the window tilted toward the mountains below. She could also feel the descent rate increasing. The pressure change in her ears was measurable, and she calculated in her head, approximately 1,500 feet per minute descent rate based on the rate of pressure change she could feel. People around her were noticing now. The Sunday afternoon calm of the cabin had cracked. Jennifer had closed her laptop. Her face had gone pale. Why are we turning so hard? Robert had looked up from his novel for the first time since takeoff. Are we going down? Other passengers were craning their necks, looking out windows, exchanging the specific frightened glances that people exchange when they know something is wrong but do not know what. Isabella was calculating. Bank angle 35 degrees, confirmed by physical sensation and visible horizon. Descent rate approximately 1,500 feet per minute. Altitude at time of PA announcement approximately 8,000 feet based on the captain's stated instrument reading. Mountains visible below, rocky mountain terrain in this area reaching peaks of 6,000 to 7,000 feet. If the pilots were experiencing spatial disorientation, if their vestibular systems were telling them they were wings level when they were actually in this steep banking descent, they would not correct. They would sit there fighting instruments they believed were broken, waiting for contradictions to resolve, while the aircraft continued its spiral downward toward terrain. Time to impact, approximately 4 minutes. Maybe less. 4 minutes. Isabella unbuckled her seatbelt. Jennifer grabbed her arm immediately. Her grip was tight, frightened, maternal. Sweetie, you need to sit down. The seatbelt sign is on, we are in some kind of. Isabella looked at her directly. Her voice was calm and quiet and completely certain. Not a child's voice asking permission. A mathematician's voice stating facts. I know what is happening. The pilots are experiencing spatial disorientation. Their instruments are working perfectly but their brain is telling them the instruments are wrong. If they do not correct in the next 3 minutes, this aircraft is going to hit a mountain. I need to get to the cockpit. Jennifer stared at her. Her mouth opened and closed once. You are a child. I am a mathematician. I study spatial disorientation. I know exactly what is happening and I know how to explain it so they can fix it. Please let go of my arm. She pulled free gently but firmly and walked forward. The aircraft was banking and descending and the cabin was filling with the sound of frightened passengers and the distant mechanical warning tones from the cockpit that were audible even through the closed door. Flight attendant Patricia was braced against the forward galley wall. She was in her 50s, experienced, the kind of flight attendant who has seen enough emergencies to know when something is genuinely wrong versus when passengers are simply anxious. Right now, she knew something was genuinely wrong because the aircraft was in a steep bank, the cockpit warning tones were audible, and the captain's PA announcement had contained that quality of barely controlled fear that flight attendants are trained to recognize. Isabella reached her. "I need to get into the cockpit." Patricia looked down at a 13-year-old girl in light-up sneakers and a math hoodie. "Honey, you absolutely need to go back to your seat and listen to me." Isabella's voice did not rise. It did not become childishly urgent or emotional. It simply became more precise. More concentrated. "Your pilots are experiencing spatial disorientation. Type 2, severe. They believe their instruments are malfunctioning but the instruments are correct. Their vestibular systems are giving them false input about their orientation. They have approximately 2 minutes before this aircraft impacts terrain. I have been studying this specific condition for 6 months. I have built mathematical models of exactly what is happening in their inner ears right now. I can explain it to them in a way they will be able to understand and act on. You need to unlock that door." Patricia stared at her. This was insane. This was a child. This was the most absurd possible thing happening at the worst possible moment. But the aircraft was in a steep banking descent. And the captain's voice on the PA had been wrong. And the cockpit warning tones had not stopped. And the instruments that Patricia could not read but could hear were still screaming. And no one else was doing anything. Patricia unlocked the cockpit door. Isabella stepped into the cockpit. She had read descriptions of Boeing 737 cockpits. She had studied diagrams. She had looked at photographs and walked through virtual simulations during research. But nothing in any of that preparation had prepared her for the reality of standing in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft in an active emergency. The instrument panel was a wall of gauges and screens and warning lights, many of them flashing red and amber. The GPWS, the Ground Proximity Warning System, was making its automated voice announcement, "Terrain. Terrain. Pull up." The cockpit was filled with the sound of multiple simultaneous warnings. Outside the windscreen, the Rocky Mountains were visible. Close. Too close for 8,000 feet of altitude. Which confirmed everything Isabella had calculated. Captain Brandon Walsh was 48 years old. He had a face that had been shaped by 22 years of professional responsibility, a face that right now showed something Isabella had never seen in a human face before, the specific terror of someone who is completely competent and completely lost simultaneously. He was gripping the control column with both hands and screaming into the radio that they had multiple instrument failures and needed immediate guidance. First Officer Amanda Rivera was 34, 6,000 hours, and she had her hands near the controls and her eyes moving rapidly between instruments with the frantic quality of someone trying to find the true reading among a panel of instruments she no longer trusted. Walsh saw Isabella. A child. In his cockpit. During an emergency. "What the, get out. We are in an emergency. Get out now." Isabella did not move. She had expected this. She had known the moment she stood up from her seat that the hardest part of this was not going to be understanding the mathematics. The hardest part was going to be making an experienced, frightened, proud professional pilot listen to a 13-year-old girl during the worst 4 minutes of his career. Her voice was calm. Young. 13 years old. But carrying something underneath it that had nothing to do with age. Your instruments are not broken. Your brain is. Walsh's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Rage. Confusion. And something underneath the confusion that looked, just for a fraction of a moment, like the beginning of a question. What? You are experiencing spatial disorientation. Type 2, severe. Your vestibular system, specifically your semicircular canals, is telling you that you are wings level or possibly banking slightly left. Your instruments are showing you a 35-degree right bank with a descent rate of approximately 1,800 feet per minute through 7,200 feet. The instruments are correct. Your body is lying to you. Walsh stared. That is impossible. I can feel that we are. Captain, I know what you can feel. I have read testimony from 47 pilots who experienced what you are experiencing right now. They all felt exactly what you are feeling. They all felt absolutely certain the instruments were wrong. 17 of those 47 did not make it back. The ones who survived were the ones who made themselves trust the instruments even when everything in their body screamed not to. Rivera turned from the instruments and stared at Isabella. You are a kid. How old are you? I am 13. I am writing a research paper on spatial disorientation in pilots. I have been studying this specific condition for 6 months. I understand the mathematics of what is happening in your vestibular system right now. You entered this bank gradually, over approximately 90 seconds, which means your semicircular canals adapted to the increasing bank angle and recalibrated it as the new normal. Your brain accepted the bank as level flight. Now when you look at your instruments showing reality, your brain reads them as malfunctioning because they contradict what feels normal. She pointed at the instrument panel. Look at your instruments. All of them. Your altimeter shows 7,200 feet. Your attitude indicator shows a 35-degree right bank. Your turn coordinator confirms the bank. Your vertical speed indicator shows a 1,800 foot per minute descent. Your airspeed is increasing because you are in a descending bank. Every single instrument on that panel is telling you the same story. For different instruments using 4 completely independent measurement systems. They cannot all be wrong simultaneously. The probability of simultaneous failure across all 4 systems is so close to 0 it is mathematically indistinguishable from impossible. Walsh was shaking his head. His hands were still on the controls. I've been flying for 22 years. I know what I feel. Captain. Isabella's voice changed slightly. It became very quiet and very direct. You have approximately 90 seconds. The terrain below you reaches 6,800 feet. You are at 7,200 feet and descending at 1,800 feet per minute. In approximately 100 seconds, this aircraft will impact the ground. Every person on this plane will die. And it will happen because you trusted what you felt instead of what you could mathematically verify. The GPWS announced again, terrain. Pull up. Terrain. Pull up. The numbers do not lie, Isabella said. Your body does. Trust your attitude indicator. Roll wings level. Trust your altimeter. Climb. The instruments are correct. Your perception is wrong. This is the mathematics of why you feel what you feel, and the mathematics is more reliable than the feeling. Silence. Or as close to silence as a cockpit can get with warning systems screaming and terrain alerts sounding and the deep mechanical groan of an aircraft in an attitude it should not be in. Walsh looked at his instruments. He had been looking at them for the past several minutes while his brain told him they were all wrong. He had been doing what 22 years of experience trained him to do, trusting himself, trusting his body, trusting his perception. Now he made himself look at them differently. He looked at the attitude indicator. 35-degree right bank. Descending. He looked at the altimeter. 7,100 feet now. It had dropped 100 feet in the second since the child had stated 7,200. He looked at the vertical speed indicator. 1,800 feet per minute down. He looked at the turn coordinator. Confirming the bank. For instruments. For independent systems. All saying the same thing. And his body saying something completely different. His body felt level. His body felt safe. His body felt like the aircraft was in some kind of shallow left bank, maybe, not the severe right bank that every instrument on the panel was reporting. Everything in 22 years of experience told him to trust himself. But a 13-year-old mathematician was standing in his cockpit telling him that the mathematics made it impossible for all four of these instruments to be simultaneously wrong, that the probability was so low it was not worth calculating, and that his body's ability to perceive orientation in three-dimensional space without a visual horizon was demonstrably, mathematically, provably unreliable. And she was right. He knew she was right. He had studied spatial disorientation in training. Every pilot does. He knew what it was. He knew it existed. He had just never, in 22 years, experienced it severely enough to make him doubt everything simultaneously. He had never been in a situation where the disjunction between what he felt and what the instruments showed was so total and so complete that he could not find any way to reconcile them. He had chosen, without consciously realizing he was making the choice, to trust his perception over his instruments. And this child was standing in his cockpit telling him that choice was going to kill 192 people. Brandon Walsh took one breath. Made one decision. And trusted the instruments. He rolled the control column to the left. Applied opposite aileron. The aircraft, fighting what every sensation in his body insisted was the wrong direction, began to roll. His body screamed at him that he was making it worse. The instruments showed the bank angle decreasing. He kept rolling. Kept applying left aileron against every physical instinct he possessed. The attitude indicator showed the wings coming level. He pulled back on the controls. Added power. Started climbing. His body told him he was banking into a turn. The instruments showed level flight. Climbing. Airspeed stabilizing. Walsh held course. Held the climb. Watched the altimeter. 7,200 feet. 7,400 feet. 7,800 feet. Climbing. The GPWS went quiet. 1 minute later, the aircraft was wings level at 10,000 feet, climbing on a stable heading, every instrument showing normal flight parameters. Brandon Walsh was shaking so hard his hands were visibly trembling on the control column. The feeling of being in a bank had not entirely gone away. His vestibular system was still sending him signals that felt wrong compared to what the instruments showed. But the instruments were stable. All four of them. All saying the same thing. Normal flight. He had trusted the mathematics over his own body. And they were alive. Walsh sat in silence for a long moment. Then he turned around. Isabella was still standing in the cockpit doorway. She had not moved. Her light-up sneakers had stopped flashing. She was watching the instruments with the focused, analytical expression of someone checking their calculations against the real-world outcome. Walsh stopped. Started again. I couldn't tell. I was completely certain the instruments were wrong. Completely certain. Isabella nodded slowly. That is the defining characteristic of Type 2 spatial disorientation. You are not uncertain. You are not confused. You are absolutely convinced that your perception is correct and the instruments are malfunctioning. The conviction is total. There is no partial doubt to work with. The doubt has to be manufactured through understanding the mathematics of why your perception is unreliable. Rivera was staring at her. How did you know? How did you know from your seat that this was happening? The bank angle increased gradually over approximately 90 seconds starting around 4:17. A standard commercial course correction takes 15 to 20 seconds and does not exceed 15 degrees of bank. This was still increasing at 25 degrees at 90 seconds. That pattern, gradual increasing bank with no correction, combined with the descent I could feel through ear pressure change, matched the profile I had been studying. When the captain announced instrument anomalies, that confirmed it. If instruments are genuinely failing catastrophically, you declare an emergency immediately. You do not announce anomalies to passengers while continuing to fly. The announcement suggested the pilots were confused about what they were seeing, not that the aircraft was mechanically failing. Walsh looked at her for a long time. "How old are you?" he said. "Not really a question at this point." 13. "And you study spatial disorientation?" "I am writing a research paper on it. Mathematical models of vestibular system failure in three-dimensional flight. I have been working on it for 6 months. This is the first time I have observed it in a real flight environment." Rivera made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else entirely. "Observed it." "She observed it." Walsh turned back to his instruments. "Check them one more time. Everything stable." He keyed his radio. "Denver Center, Southwest 3742. We have recovered from a spatial disorientation incident. Climbing to assigned altitude. We are stable and continuing to Denver International." The radio crackled. "Southwest 3742, Denver Center. Very glad to hear it. Can you describe what happened?" Walsh paused. He looked back at Isabella one more time. "A 13-year-old passenger identified our spatial disorientation from her seat in economy, came to the cockpit, and explained the mathematics of why our perception was wrong and our instruments were correct. She talked us through recovery. We are stable." A long silence on the frequency. "Southwest 3742, say again your last." "I will explain on the ground, Denver Center. We are stable. Continuing to destination." Walsh put the radio down. "Go back to your seat," he said to Isabella. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who has just been through something they do not yet have language for. "Please. And thank you." Isabella nodded. Pushed her glasses up her nose. Turned and walked back through the cockpit door. Her sneakers started flashing purple and pink again as she walked. The flight landed at Denver International Airport at 5:42 p.m. It taxied to the gate normally. The passengers deplaned normally. Most of them had not fully understood what had happened, only that there had been some kind of turbulence or technical issue and that the aircraft had made some steep maneuvers for a few minutes before returning to normal. But a few passengers in the forward rows had heard fragments. Had seen a child walk to the cockpit and come back. Had seen the flight attendant's face during those 7 minutes. They knew something significant had happened. At the gate, before the jetway door opened, Captain Walsh came out of the cockpit. He walked down the aisle to row 9. Isabella was sitting in her seat, her marble composition notebook open in her lap, a pencil in her hand. She had gone back to work. Walsh stood in the aisle next to her seat. He was 48 years old. 18,000 hours of flight experience. 3 commendations. An unblemished safety record across 22 years of professional aviation. He looked at a 13-year-old girl doing advanced mathematics in a purple hoodie. "Miss Vasquez," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. "You saved this aircraft." Isabella looked at him steadily. "You saved this aircraft, Captain. I gave you the mathematics. You had to make yourself trust them against everything your body was telling you. That is the harder thing. That is the actually impossible thing. And you did it." Walsh stood there for a moment. Then he nodded once, turned around, and walked back to the cockpit. Outside the gate windows, Dr. Maria Vasquez was waiting. An aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin. The mother who had sat with her 2-year-old daughter and watched her point at errors in engineering textbooks. Who had arranged university audits for a 9-year-old. Who had read her 11-year-old's published research paper with tears in her eyes. When Isabella came through the gate door, her mother pulled her into a hug without saying anything at all for a full 30 seconds. Then she pulled back and looked at her daughter. "How was your flight?" Isabella pushed her glasses up her nose. "Eventful," she said. The FAA investigation began the following morning. The flight data recorder told the story with perfect mathematical precision. Beginning at 4:15 p.m., the aircraft had entered a gradual right banking turn. Over the course of approximately 90 seconds, the bank had increased to 35 degrees. The aircraft had simultaneously begun a descending spiral, losing altitude at a rate that would have brought it into contact with terrain within an estimated 90 to 110 seconds of the point at which a passenger had entered the cockpit. All instruments had been functioning normally throughout the incident. The altimeter, attitude indicator, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, turn coordinator, all working perfectly. All reporting accurate information. All confirmed by independent cross-checking against GPS altitude data and radar tracking from Denver Center. The pilots had been experiencing severe spatial disorientation. Both simultaneously. A condition made possible by the gradual onset of the bank angle, which had allowed both pilots' vestibular systems to adapt incrementally rather than registering a sudden, obvious change. The incident had been identified and recovery initiated by a passenger. The passenger's name was Isabella Vasquez. Age 13. The FAA report, which was detailed and careful and written by people who had spent their careers documenting aviation incidents, included a section that investigators later described as unlike anything they had written before. It described how a 13-year-old with no flight training or aviation certification had identified the nature of the emergency from a passenger seat in economy class, assessed the time to impact based on observable flight parameters, navigated to the cockpit, and provided a technically accurate and effectively communicated explanation of spatial disorientation that had enabled the flight crew to override their sensory input and trust their instruments. The report used the word remarkable 4 times. Aviation investigation reports almost never use the word remarkable. It was entered into congressional record during hearings on cockpit safety protocols. The clip of Walsh's radio call, "A 13-year-old passenger identified our spatial disorientation and talked us through recovery," was played in the hearing chamber. One senator, a former Navy pilot who had experienced spatial disorientation himself during training decades ago, sat quietly for a moment after the clip played and then said, "Get that kid in front of this committee. I want to hear from her directly." Isabella gave exactly one media interview before her mother and her own judgment led her to decline the rest. It was for the local Denver News. A reporter who had the wisdom to bring a notebook and the self-awareness to mostly ask short questions and let Isabella talk. "Can you introduce yourself?" "I am Isabella Vasquez. I am 13 years old. I am in 8th grade. I study advanced mathematics. Can you explain what happened on the flight?" The pilots were experiencing spatial disorientation. Their vestibular systems, which is the part of the inner ear that tells you which direction is up, had been fooled by a gradual increase in bank angle. They had adapted to the bank as their new normal orientation. So when they looked at their instruments showing the actual reality, their brains interpreted the instruments as malfunctioning. I recognized the pattern from my research and went to explain the mathematics to them. "Were you scared?" A pause. I was focused. I do not know if that is the same as not scared. There was a problem with a solution. I understood the problem and the solution. The important thing was communicating the solution clearly and quickly. There was not time to also be scared. What do you want people to understand about what happened? I want people to understand 2 things. The first is that spatial disorientation is the most dangerous psychological condition in aviation. Not mechanical failure. Not weather. The pilot's own brain. Experienced pilots with thousands of hours can experience it. It does not care about your qualifications or your experience or your skill. Understanding the mathematics of why it happens is the most important tool for surviving it. And the second thing? Isabella thought for a moment. Captain Walsh did something much harder than what I did. I understood the mathematics. I had the numbers. The numbers gave me certainty. Captain Walsh had no certainty. He had every sensation in his body telling him he was right and I was wrong. He had 22 years of experience telling him to trust himself. And he made himself doubt that experience and trust something that felt completely wrong because the logic required it. That is the actually impossible thing. Not what I did. What he did. I gave him the mathematics. He had to do the impossible thing with them. He had to trust numbers over his own body, over his own history, over everything his experience had taught him. That is harder than anything I have ever done. And he did it in 90 seconds. The reporter waited a moment. Is there anything you want to add? Isabella pushed her glasses up her nose. I am going to finish my paper, she said. I have a lot more data to work with now. The marble composition notebook, pages 1 through 63, was eventually donated by Isabella to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where it sits in a case in the aviation safety exhibit. Page 47 contains the rotation matrix calculation she was working on at the moment the bank began. If you look closely at the bottom of the page, in the margin, there is a small notation in sharp pencil, for 17 p.m. Beginning observed. And below that, after a gap, for 24 p.m. Recovered. All values confirmed. A 7-minute gap in the middle of a mathematical proof. 7 minutes that held 192 lives. Captain Brandon Walsh retired from Southwest Airlines in 2023. In his retirement announcement, he mentioned the flight only once, in a single sentence. I learned more about flying and about myself in 7 minutes over Colorado than in any of the other 17,993 flight hours combined. Dr. Maria Vasquez keeps a framed copy of the FAA incident report on her office wall at Lockheed Martin. The section marked "Recovery Initiated by" is highlighted in yellow. Isabella Vasquez published her research paper on spatial disorientation the following spring, at age 13. It was cited 18 times in the first year of publication. She presented it at a conference where the average age of presenters was 44. She wore her purple hoodie. The light-up sneakers flashed the whole time. She has never stopped doing mathematics. The numbers, she says, are the one thing that never lies. December 15, 2019. Sunday. 4:17 p.m. The instrument panel was lying. Except it wasn't. And a 13-year-old girl knew the difference.